Alrighty, it looks like we're 3 after the hour and we only have an hour scheduled together today. So I'm gonna go ahead and kick us off. So welcome everyone to our climate anxiety and mental health training for today. Glad you could all join us. So, a little bit about Midwest BDC. Our mission is to develop and implement equitable strategies to achieve zero emissions from the Midwestern building sector by 2050. We know that everyone defines the Midwest a little bit differently. So, our 8 priority states are Michigan, Minnesota, Illinois, Wisconsin, Ohio, Missouri, Indiana, and Iowa. But we have members from outside the region, some national groups. So, everyone is welcome. But these are the 8 states that we prioritize in our work. And I just wanted to highlight our community norms before we dive into the webinar today. So these are our community norms that we practice in our webinars and meeting spaces, and I'll just read them off real quickly. Notice intent, lean towards impact, use I statements, practice self-awareness, stop and witness, assume good intentions, listen for understanding, not to respond, wait, why am I talking, why aren't I talking? Practice active listening. Remember that everyone's a teacher and everyone's a learner. Share responsibility for keeping to the norms. Adhere to speak next indicators on Zoom. Sometimes we'll have a chance to use the raise hand function if you want to come off of mute. So we just ask that everyone respects that as we try to move through a lot of speakers sometimes. Show up in your authentic self. Speak to the whole group. Minimize jargon and explain terms when you're asked. And participate and lean into discomfort. All right, and that brief little intro is really all from me. I'm going to turn it over to our speaker today, Bailey Fullwiler. So welcome, Bailey. Bailey, I'll read her bio real quickly and then we'll jump into her presentation. So Bailey is joining us as a regional organizer for the Climate Reality Project, where she supports local petrochemical campaign work in her home state of Ohio. Bailey has a background in social work and supporting communities in the mental health impacts of climate injustice. Prior to joining Climate Reality, Bailey has researched ecological grief and partnered with environmental groups throughout the Midwest to address trauma and build resilience in the climate movement. Bailey studied social work with a concentration in community practice for social change at Case Western Reserve University. In addition, Bailey is a trauma-informed yoga instructor who teaches with the nonprofit Queer Behavior and in local halfway houses. Outside of work, she fills her time visiting local coffee shops, reading fantasy, and hiking. Awesome. So welcome, Bailey. I'm super excited to have her here today. We were talking just before the call. We are both from Ohio, so glad to have another Ohio friend on the call. And with that, I'm going to stop my screen share and turn it over to Bailey for a presentation. Welcome.
Hey y'all, it's really good to be with you. I was super excited. I don't meet a lot of folks that ask me to talk about climate change and mental health anymore. It's usually all burnout, which we'll get into a little bit too. My name's Bailey. I use she, her pronouns. And this presentation is really going to look at how climate injustice impacts our mental health, and then how do we take care of ourselves and each other so we can stay in this movement, but also stay well in this movement, because we know our wellness is really going to impact how we do our work and how we take care of each other and our planet. And so this is a little bit of what you can expect from our time together today. We're going to look into, what is exactly happening when we see climate injustice impacting our mental health. How do we talk about it? So how do we create a shared language and understanding of these impacts? And then what makes us more vulnerable and what keeps us more protected? And then we're going to dig into practices, and that's my favorite part of it's good to have the information, but then what do you do with it? And then we'll talk a little bit about resources, and Maggie was really kind and she's going to share out hopefully both these slides and then a resource guide that I provide to all of my clients when they're working on climate distress. And then we'll have time for questions because I want to hear what's showing up for y'all. But we're going to start with a really short grounding practice. Of course, you're welcome to participate as little or as much as you'd like to. But the invitation would be to come to a seat where you can be tall and let your shoulders come away from your ears. And if possible, have both feet firmly on the ground beneath you. And then as you come into what you find a comfortable seat, the invitation will be to have your palms face down on your legs. And then if it feels comfortable, soften the gaze or close your eyes. And we'll start with noticing what it feels like to breathe today. If it comes easy or if it feels difficult. Maybe noting the temperature of the air as it comes in through your nose. And you could stay here noticing your breath. Or if it feels interesting, bring to mind your favorite sound in nature. Maybe the tree frogs that are coming back, the sound of water, wind moving through high grass or leaves. Whatever sound in nature brings you joy, focus your attention on that sound. And then as you feel ready, you can shift your focus back to the room around you, blinking open eyes or wiggling toes. And if you like, you're welcome to put your favorite sound in nature into the chat. I really like hearing different folks. I had a couple of Ohioans mention cicadas, which aren't coming through Ohio this year. So I'm a big fan of cicada love. But that's something I really like to think about is, where do we find joy in our work and where do we find joy when we're resting from our work? And so the sounds of nature is definitely something I think we come back to. One of my favorite audiologists says that he's never made more sound recordings than of the sound of rain, because lots of folks like different sounds of rain, whether it's like hitting a tin roof or hitting a body of water. And I just really delighted in the fact that so many people love rain and it sounds different to all of them. But we'll move into this intersection. And so a lot of times when folks learn that I'm a social worker and I'm looking at climate injustice and mental health, they want to know like why that intersection, why is that important? And I just want to ground before we move into our presentation of this concept of the ecological determinants of health. And you've probably heard the social determinants of health. But in social work, we use a person and environment understanding of health and look at how whatever that environment, whether it's social, built, or natural, or the larger political and global ecosystem that they're existing in, how that's going to influence their health and what support we can offer them. And so I share this ecological determinants of health because you can't have injustice or harm happening in one area of your community or in your world and have it not negatively influence another. And so while we know a lot about the health risk of climate change, it's going to change our mental health just as much as our physical health. And so something that we're working on both in my field and then with my clients is recognizing that when there's injury to the built environment, when there's injury to the natural environment, when there's injury to the ecosystem, the larger climate stability and biodiversity loss, of course, that's going to influence your mental health because you live in that system. And anything that damages one part of the system is going to harm another. And anything we can do to care for one is going to be of benefit to the other. And that's what we look at a lot in climate aware therapy is how can we support you and your mental well-being, because anything that protects you is going to allow you to show up and protect your community. And I think probably everyone on this call feels that that growing desire to protect both ourselves, the people we love, and then the world that we live in. And then the other resource I always put in all my presentations is the climate emotions wheel. Because when we talk about the intersection, it's not just doom and gloom. There's a lot of folks that find a lot of joy, but we also need to honor the anger, the sadness, and the fear that shows up when we are both navigating the systems of harm that we're in right now and the ones that we're witnessing. And so I like the climate emotion wheel a lot because sometimes it's really hard for me to figure out what's showing up, whether I'm in like a coalition call or I'm talking to a family member, or I'm reading the news. I like the climate wheel just because it helps me think through, like, I'm not just feeling scared and sad or angry. Like, there's a lot of things showing up for me. And especially in that anger piece, you see outrage and betrayal and disappointment. When I work, especially with teenagers and young adults, really being able to honor that, like, rage is a really healthy response to what's happening to us and to the things and people that we love. And so how can we show up and honor those emotions and not avoid them and not, live in them, but how do we honor them so that they can influence our work in meaningful ways? And so that's just kind of my opening grounding for this intersection of, you know, there is just one health. Like everything is going to influence one piece of our health, the economic health, the social health, our physical health, our mental health, our planet health is all intersected. And there's lots of different ways that we can explore like what's showing up for us in different moments when we're navigating this shared work. So when we talk about the scope, a lot of people want to ask me how prevalent is mental distress around climate injustice. And the truth is we don't have a lot of standard measurements, and I like to name that. We're going to look a lot at the causes when we move into risk factors and vulnerabilities, so we're not going to dig into that right here. But when we talk about prevalence, I like to name that we don't have standard measurements to determine how much folks are experiencing climate distress. And that's a lot because we don't have a standard language for it. And that's why when we move through this presentation, we're going to talk a lot about language so we can be able to identify and connect with other people and also ask for what we need. And so that's one thing when we're looking at reports that say how much climate distress folks are experiencing, I'm going to assume that that's drastically underreported because we don't have standard measurements to be able to ask people the right questions of how climate injustices are influencing their mental health, and if we always recognize that the negative experiences we're having relate to climate injustice. The other thing that I like to name is this does vary by generation, by our identities and our geography. And so I work a lot in the Midwest. The Midwest has experienced a lot of its biodiversity loss generations prior. And so coastal communities like the West Coast and East Coast of the United States, when I work with those geographies, they're having a very different experience because they're having very visual senses of loss. And so that's going to influence how they feel. When we talk about identity, we're going to move into a lot about how, our culture, our history, our professions, our relationship with land, all these different identities that we have is going to influence how high the prevalence is. So I work a lot with farmers in the Midwest. Farmers are feeling a lot more climate distress than other folks who aren't seeing their profession change as drastically and aren't feeling senses of loss around knowledge that they've built within their community, within their profession, and is now being drastically changed because of climate change. The other thing when it comes to generation is this isn't universally true, but my work started in ecological grief, and I was working a lot more with older adults who were tending towards depression, towards grief, towards guilt, of losses that they've witnessed and feelings of loss for their loved ones, their children, and their grandchildren. And then more recently, I've been working with a lot of young folks, and we see a lot more anxiety about the future, a lot more feelings of anger and frustration and betrayal. And that's not universal. Like there are young folks experiencing feelings of grief and depressive symptoms, and there are older adults who are also feeling outrage and anxiety about the future. But there are generational differences that we're seeing. And the other thing to name is when we're measuring the prevalence of how much climate distress folks are experiencing, it matters when you measure it. because humans aren't good at sustaining prolonged stress and fear about something. We're really good about having a stress response and then being able to act it out. We can't really maintain high levels of fear unless we're actively not getting our needs met. And so when I talk about cyclical, I live in Ohio. I used to really enjoy summer. It was my favorite season. Now I feel a lot of stress and anxiety coming towards summer because I know it's very likely that we're going to have really bad air quality in my region again. And I know that I need to be ready to support my community with how that poor air quality is going to impact them and how extreme heat is going to impact myself and my neighbors. And so if you measure how I feel about climate distress in the spring, it's going to be very different than I feel in the fall. And so how we measure that really matters. But the most comprehensive study that the Yale Climate Communications School did looked and saw about 7% of the US adult population reported feeling mild to higher than mild levels of climate distress. And 7% is like a hard number to visualize. So I'll just share that 8% of the US population experiences major depressive disorder. That's about 21 million. That's about 1 million less than the population of the state of New York. And so you can imagine a little bit less than the state of New York for adults reported that they were feeling mild to more than mild feelings of climate distress. And that's even with all of our imperfect measurements, we're seeing that a pretty large and growing population of US adults in particular are experiencing climate distress. And when we talk about outcomes, the things that we look at most commonly is there's different paths we can take when we feel climate distress show up. We can move to climate denial and dissociation. We can try to move away from that. We can move towards depressive symptoms and self-isolate and feel hopelessness. When we're looking at folks that are experiencing extreme conditions, especially drought, we see that with that hopelessness, there can be an increase in suicidal ideations. And then we can also see conflict, dysfunction, and burnout. And this is what I see the most in the climate organizations that I work at, is folks are feeling climate distress. And because they have all of these emotions that they're not being supported with, or maybe not acknowledging, that leads to more conflict within our movement, more dysfunction when we're trying to plan campaigns or actions, and then higher levels of burnout and attrition. And that doesn't have to be the outcome. There's a lot of really beneficial things to being with our climate distress and being able to be with the feelings that show up with how we feel about climate injustice. But these are kind of the outcomes when people do not get the support that they deserve and aren't in a community where they can express those feelings. And so when we're looking at how big is this intersection, this is what I like to talk about is this is the piece that's missing, this is what we know, and this is what we're seeing and how folks are being harmed when climate distress isn't honored, when it isn't supported, either individually or in community, but especially in community. And so the foundation, when we're talking about climate distress, is just that, stress. So we know that stress can be really adaptive and a good thing when we experience a stressor and we're able to act on it. That can be really great for us to accomplish goals and to be able to keep ourselves safe. The problem with climate distress is that the concerns we're facing are really prolonged and ongoing. And so prolonged stress that we're not able to live out the stress cycle, we're not able to act and feel like we get to a point of completion or safety. That prolonged stress really wears at our physical body and it really wears at our mental health. And so the ways that I visualize, like, what does this stress look like and how it's impacting our mental health? The biggest things are we see disruption. So climate change and climate injustice really disrupts our daily lives, both in big ways and in small ways. And so one of those things is when there's wildfire smoke, when there are wildfires, where there are tornadoes, when there's hurricanes, when there's flooding, when there's all these stressors that we're navigating, when the air quality is so bad you can't go outside, you can't engage in those pro-social behaviors that are really meaningful to you. So we see a lot of school cancellations in the Midwest. We see work cancellation if the conditions aren't safe for folks to go outside. There's been lots of events last summer where I live in Columbus, Ohio, that got canceled because of the wildfire smoke, because it wasn't safe for us to recreate outside. And so we're not able to run, walk our dogs, be outside and garden, sunbathe, go to work, go to school, do these things that are social and help our health and keep us healthy. The other thing when we move into more extremes is folks are having to shelter in place or evacuate, which can be really isolating. And so I work with a lot of communities that live near petrochemical facilities. Those petrochemical facilities have flare-ups. And so there are times where there's increased concern for fire, for increased air, pollution, that's not safe to be outside for us or our animals. And so people are sheltering in place, or they're isolating, or they're having to evacuate. And so they're not getting their social needs met, and they're not able to engage in their normal coping skills that would support their mental health. So disruption is like the name of the game when we're talking about climate injustice and mental health. When we think a lot about climate anxiety, and we'll talk about this more, anxiety is a preoccupation with the future and concern for the future. And so with climate distress, we see a lot of folks that are having a difficult time planning for the future or being able to envision a positive future for themselves. And so you might see there's a lot of groups that are talking about radical imagination and reimagining our future. And so when we're in that state of distress and we're in that state of anxiety and we can't envision a positive future for ourselves, we're seeing folks engage in a lot of decisions that are really painful or hurtful to their mental health. And so that could be making decisions about continued schooling, about raising a family or having children, financial planning. So we see a lot of times with teenagers and Gen Z that folks aren't sure how to make decisions about retirement planning, because one, they don't know if there'll be a planet for them to retire on, and two, a lot of our pension plans and retirement plans invest in fossil fuels. And so folks aren't able to engage in future planning where they can have a positive future for themselves because they have no idea what the future holds. And so a lot of those fears are really valid. And also, how can we move through the world if we're not planning for a future with ourselves in it? And so that's where we see a lot of mental health concerns. And then, as you will not be surprised at all, there's a lot of research on how extreme weather impacts our mental health. Heat waves are the ones that I focus the most on the Midwest because I live in an urban area. So a lot of our communities are hit really hard by the urban heat island effect. And so what we see is that with psychotropic medications and some non-psychotropic medications, they aren't as effective during extreme heat. I used to work in our correctional facilities as a reentry social worker. And so lack of air conditioning, extreme heat, lots of folks experiencing trauma and needing psychotropic medications for support. You can imagine how much dysfunction that causes and how that furthers criminal injustice, but then, not criminal injustice, but how we see injustice in our criminal justice system, and how we see injustice in our mental health system, where folks aren't getting the information they need to know about how to stay safe on the medications that they take. And then they're also being negatively impacted by extreme weather in their medications. And then heat waves are also some of the most studied because we see increases in aggression, domestic violence, and violent crimes. And so like I do a lot of canvassing in the city of Columbus when there is a shooting or when there's a traumatic homicide. And so we see those go up when we have extreme heat. And so that negatively impacts, of course, the people whose lives we've lost, but then everybody who loved them and everybody who heard or witnessed it through vicarious or secondary trauma. And so extreme weather is a huge disruption on our well-being. That moves really beautifully into exposure to secondary trauma and 24/7 media coverage. Our brains are not made to be able to handle constant information, especially constant negative information. We already have a negativity bias where we're looking for negative information. And so we know that the way that the media cycle works and the way that social media algorithms work is we're more likely to see negative climate news than positive climate news. And so if folks are already feeling concern or distress around climate injustice, and they're getting constant confirmation bias that things are not going well, then you can imagine how that would impact, feelings of hopelessness, and feelings of distress. And so that's why I work a lot with clients on making sure that they're getting balanced news and they're setting boundaries with how much information they're receiving from their phones and from the media, because there is a lot of beautiful things happening in our climate movement that we can celebrate and see as well. And then also we know that all the information we get is important. We need good information, but we're not built to be able to handle constant information. And so that's something we work a lot with my clients on, is how do we set meaningful boundaries and have balanced information about what's happening with our climate change. And then obviously there's huge negative health impacts for pollution, especially for those living near polluting facilities. So if you live near a fossil fuel facility or a petrochemical facility, there is a ton of noise pollution, which really racks up stress in the body. It impacts how well we sleep. And when we don't sleep, we have a lot of mental health distress and psychotropic symptoms. And then there's also this inability to access health benefits of green and blue spaces. So if you live in a polluted area, there's a good chance that you don't feel comfortable or it's not safe for you if there are green and blue spaces to visit them. And because we're so hardwired to gain mental health benefits from green and blue spaces, that's a huge risk to our mental and physical health if we aren't able to safely access those places because of pollution or if they don't exist. And so I like to start with this foundation of stress when we talk about climate injustice and mental health, because there is a lot of talk about climate anxiety and ecological grief. But really, like when we're talking about climate injustice, which is really impacting every community, though every community differently, everyone is experiencing stress as a result of climate change and climate injustice. And so these are things that anybody could be navigating and deserve support and care when we're navigating that. So that's a little bit of a foundational of when climate injustice impacts, what is the first concern we have is like stress and how we support people so they're not experiencing overtaxation through stress. But moving into key language, I remember the first time I did a study on ecological grief, folks were like, why would I call it that? Like, why would I want to grieve nature? Like, what would that do me good? And like I was working with lawyers that were fighting environmental cases. And what we find is that when we don't have a language to talk about our experiences, we can't connect with others over it. And we're not able to seek support. And so that's why I think creating a shared language is so unbelievably meaningful. I want to pause though, because there's a question. I don't want to get too far away. So the question is, I'm curious for you to speak more on how to limit negative environmental information when it's so ambiguous and seeking positive environmental information, which is so rare and often mixed. And so, Marshall, some of that will come in the resource guide that you receive, because there are a lot of accounts that are verified, that are trustworthy, that I recommend to my clients, that give really balanced views of like, what are our climate wins, what's going well, what are we looking hopeful towards for the future. And so I have accounts and media sources that I recommend specifically for folks. So you'll get that in the resource guide. Okay, so let's dig into our shared language. Cool. So climate anxiety or eco-anxiety is probably the thing you hear the most about. And I know that I've committed the cardinal sin if I put too many words on a slide, but this is just because y'all will get these slides afterwards. And I think it's really helpful to have this with you if it's helpful. And so climate anxiety is all about that heightened emotional, mental, and then somatic. So what's happening in our body, but all about that distress that shows up when we're navigating a dangerous climate system. And something I like to talk about always is this reminder that climate anxiety is typically not what's happening right now. A lot of times we know we might be safe in this very moment or in the foreseeable future, but we know that we have these huge stresses ahead of us. So climate anxiety is all about anticipatory concern for the future. The other thing that I like to name is that climate anxiety is super adaptive. So a lot of times we hear anxiety and we're like, that's a bad word. I don't want to feel anxious. But it's adaptive to feel distress around a huge existential crisis that we're facing. And so when we are able to acknowledge the fact that we are feeling anxiety, acknowledge the fact that there is a real threat that we are navigating, and to be able to connect with others and then act on that, it's incredibly adaptive. It's of benefit. I think a lot of people are in the climate movement right now because they felt concern and anxiety about the future, and they wanted to be a part of the solution. And so I know, like, we talk a lot about positive emotions and negative emotions in the media. It's incredibly adaptive when you're able to act on it and be supported in it to experience climate anxiety. If you didn't, ever feel climate anxiety, it's probably because you're dissociating, because it's too much to handle in your body. The other thing I like to name is sometimes, like especially university professors or folks that are supporting young people, want me to come in to teach about climate anxiety because they are concerned about the amount of anger or frustration they see. And anger is not a bad emotion. It's just an emotion that we're really uncomfortable with in the United States. And so a lot of climate or eco anxiety is rooted in the sense of injustice. And so the sense of anger that, like, it is not fair what is happening to our communities. It's not fair that there's a disproportionate impact on folks that are already experiencing oppression when it comes to climate injustice. And this feeling of rage or injustice around unnecessary death and loss that we're experiencing because of inaction or because of putting profit over people on the planet. And so I understand that anger is an uncomfortable emotion and we can't always act on anger in the ways that we'd want to. Anger is not a bad emotion. It's not an emotion we need to avoid. And like, it's not ethical to try to teach people to like avoid their anger or that it's not okay to be angry about what's happening. And so I just like to name that both for adults and young people, is that anger is a natural response to injustice and it's part of the evolution of humans and our fairness bias. And the other thing that's really challenging that I just like to name around climate anxiety is that we do not have a standard measurement for it. So most climate anxiety is self-reported, and that's not good or bad. It's just something to keep in mind, is that we don't have as good of information as we have about how many folks are feeling climate anxiety. Those are just things to know if they're helpful or resonate with you. This is my jam. I'm a grief girly. I love talking about mourning and supporting people through loss. Grief is a really important thing. It's a really empowering thing. It's a collective thing, though we do tend to avoid grief in the United States as well. But climate change or climate grief or ecological grief, it's just those feelings of loss and mourning around nature. And that could be around species, ecosystems, or landscapes. And when we look at types, I like to mention that like there's physical losses. So I work with zookeepers who have experienced feelings of grief around extinction or species loss. There's cultural loss. So you see the person listed up there, Ashley Consolo. She's one of the biggest researchers of ecological grief. She works a lot with Indigenous communities in Canada who have experienced high levels of cultural loss. And then I work with communities in the Appalachian region of the Ohio River Valley around cultural loss. And so like the example I'll give is when you experience mountaintop removal, not only is it a physical loss, but like the stories you had around a mountain, the ability to forage, the ability to know about your landscape and know what's safe and is not safe changes with climate injustice. And so there are cultural losses in addition to physical losses. And then we can also experience anticipatory grief. And so that can look like when you know that a destructive process or project is coming to your community and you feel anticipatory loss around the damage it will cause. It can also happen with species. So when we're hearing or seeing stories about species that are endangered or lost, that can be that anticipatory grief when they're endangered and they're moving towards extinction. Some things that I think are helpful to know about ecological grief is that humans are really only able to hold grief for a specific loss that you experienced an attachment to. And so while I might feel concern or feelings of loss around like the wildfires that were really huge in the news in Australia, I'm not going to grieve those the way that I would what's happening in Appalachian, Ohio, where I live, because I don't have a relationship or attachment to that land. And so when you're looking at yourself and then people that you're supporting in your community, your loved ones, or like the folks that you work with in coalition, just know that like humans grieve specific losses that they have an attachment to. And that's something I think through when I'm working with folks, if they have a deep attachment to land that's being harmed or things that we're working on, to be able to show up and support them in the grief or loss that they're feeling. Ecological grief can also be challenging because it's also disenfranchised. And so disenfranchisement means when we don't have culturally prescribed ways to be able to acknowledge a loss. This used to be really true for pet loss. Folks didn't get the support or have practices to be able to acknowledge just how much grief they felt when a pet passed away. And so we've worked on being able to provide people ways to come together and acknowledge that loss. And that's, kind of replicated in what we're doing with ecological grief, is making sure that people have a way to mourn ecological losses that they're experiencing. And then ecological grief can also be complicated because folks might feel shame or guilt or want to resist or deny an environmental loss. And that's because in some part, we all operate in this culture. We all operate, well, that's not true. In Western culture, many of us feel forced to engage in systems of capitalism and oppressive systems that work towards environmental degradation and harm. And so those feelings can be complicated. And as like working with clients, what I really try to hit home is like no one person is responsible for ecological degradation, even though we all have power to act on it. Like we are not individually responsible, and we can't blame ourselves for what industry and decision makers have done to our environmental degradation through inaction or through bad policy. And so those are just things I like to name that show up with ecological grief if they're helpful for you. Solastalgia is a word that has been showing up a lot in the communities I work with that experience industry disasters or man-made disasters. And a lot of times it's described feeling homesick when you're still at home. So if your home landscape has been damaged or no longer looks the same, like here in Ohio, we had the train derailment in East Palestine. And so that home is forever different. And so some folks are feeling solastalgia about the fact that their neighborhood and their home is forever changed by that industry disaster. And some things to know about solastalgia is that it's place-based. So it's specific to a community that you connect with at home, whether it's like your childhood home or where you've become at home. It's specific to degradation, so witnessing changes to your natural environment. Usually it's about rapid change. So like when I first started studying ecological grief, there were a lot of folks that would mention like, I don't see fireflies anymore, or like this species of frog is no longer in my community. And those were slow changes, so they more relate to feelings of grief and loss. Whereas rapid changes, like with the coral reef bleaching, we often see folks feeling solastalgia of like, there's been a rapid change and my home is no longer my home. And then the thing that we look at a lot is folks have a sense of loss of solace. And so like they no longer feel safe or comfortable in a place that used to feel safe and comfortable to them. And so this comes up a lot for folks that have experienced living near a polluting facility or experiencing extreme weather incident. And so solastalgia can just be a really helpful language, I think, for a lot of people to be able to connect with that feeling of homesickness when you're still at home. And then the thing that I work the most on is environmental trauma. And so that's anytime someone's experienced an overwhelming lack of safety because of climate injustice. Natural disasters, quote unquote, natural disasters tend to get the most media coverage, but man-made disasters or industry disasters have the same impact on people, especially when we're talking about fossil fuel industry. And there's just so much more we could do to support each other when we experience environmental trauma. But some things to know about environmental trauma is it's usually acute. And by acute, I mean like trauma is usually something that is intense. It's longer than we can withstand, and it has a huge impact on our feeling of safety. Environmental trauma can be cyclical, like we talked about at the beginning. And so some communities experience season after season the same traumatic event. And so like we see the trauma symptoms show up leading up to that particular season or that particular concern. And then trauma usually isn't about a specific event, it's about how much support you got afterwards. And so environmental trauma has a lot to do with climate injustice because it happens when folks did not get the support that they needed. And we know that when there are disasters, like homeowners get more support than renters. We see over and over again that white wealthy communities get more support than poor BIPOC communities. And so we know that there's an unjust response to who gets aid and who doesn't. In Appalachia, we see that we don't get the declarations of emergency. So we don't get federal funds to support our emergencies, whereas a lot of cities will get a state of emergency where they get federal funds. And so that's part of the trauma is the injustice in the response. And so when people aren't supported after a traumatic event or an event that could be traumatic, that's when you see the symptoms of trauma start to show up. And so this one to me is the most that stands out, where climate injustice has a huge impact on how folks are mentally cared for following an event. Okay, now that I talked about a bunch of sad things, we're going to talk about who's most likely to experience distress around climate change. And again, that's not a bad thing. It can be a really beautiful adaptive thing that shows that you are in connection with the world around you and with others. But when we look at what makes us more vulnerable to having those feelings of distress, this is just for you to be able to look out for yourself and others to know if this is showing up for you. And so things that might make us vulnerable is if we have a relationship to land, whether we have a cultural or a professional, like I was talking about with farmers, if they have a professional relationship with the land or a personal, the more connected to something we are, the more likely we are to have feelings about how it's treated. And then that goes hand in hand with the beliefs we have about the value and care for non-human living things. The other thing that shows up a lot that we have some agency and power over is our external and internal resources. And so something I see a lot for folks working in the environmental movement is all of their hobbies are related to being in nature, but then sometimes it's hard for them to turn off their brain thinking about their work when they're trying to recreate. And so having diverse hobbies can be really helpful for folks. And there's having practice is this like self-compassion or mindfulness, or being in a supportive community. So those are all things when we don't have them make it harder for us to move through climate distress. And then obviously the closer you are to something distressing, the more likely it is to impact you. And then if you have existing vulnerabilities, the more likely it is to impact you. Again, that's not to say that that's a bad thing to feel climate distress. It just means that we're in relationship and attached. These are just for us to know so that we can be looking out for our own well-being and the well-being of our loved ones if we know that they're more likely to be struggling. And then we talk about protective factors, so what makes us resilient? Resilience is when we're able to bounce back from a setback or from a challenging event. And so I don't want to teach people to be resilient in systems of oppression, but I do want people to be cared for and to have things to protect them because we know that systems change isn't going to happen overnight. And so when we talk about resilience, it's how do we care for ourselves and each other so we can stay in this movement and stay well in this movement. And the things that really keep us safe are engaging in community practices. So isolation, we don't heal in isolation, we heal in community. So having community practices. So one of the things I work on is supporting communities that want to do memorial services or have different gatherings around an ecological loss. You know, I know that there are folks that have been moving their meetings outside so that they can have community practices around connection instead of being always in our built environment. And so building that into your volunteer work, your friend community, your family community, but having practices to support us makes a huge difference. There are particular coping skills that we see come up again and again that keep us safe. Self-compassion is a huge one because we are so hardwired to feel guilt or concern, and especially when fossil fuel industries try to blame consumers for the climate crisis. Self-compassion is an important skill to have. Mindfulness, so you know what's going on and showing up for you. Being able to know for somatic literacy, that's just like knowing what's showing up in your body. So like when you are feeling stress and anxiety, what does that feel like in your body and how do you support it? And then making sure that you have access to mental health resources. And again, I will send out a ton of free, available for everyone mental health resources that relate to climate change and mental health. Being a part of a supportive community is the best protective factor I have found in my work with clients. And so making sure that you are an active member, so not just like on Zoom or online, but you are an active member and in connection with other people who care about the things that you do and are concerned about you and want to act with you, is the best outlet. Having an outlet for our climate distress is going to keep it from consuming us or isolating us or us dissociating. This one's a little tricky. We do see a lot of good evidence that intergenerational relationships and movements are much stronger and have mental health benefits. That's not to say that it's always smooth and easy, and that different generations don't have different approaches or understanding to justice movements that can be hard to navigate. But when done well, intergenerational relationships and movements can be really protective. And then to this point, celebrations. Any win that we can celebrate in our climate movement is going to make us stronger and more resilient because we need those little wins to keep us up for the really big hard work that we're doing. And so that's something I work with a lot of my clients, is how do we integrate actually celebrating the wins that we have instead of just keeping our head down and working, and not acknowledging any wins that we've had in our communities or in our movement. And so this is something I really like to talk about when we're looking at types of care. And so there are self-soothing practices. So these are the things that you do immediately after a crisis or after a stressor to provide yourself soothing. That could be eating your favorite food, taking a bubble bath, or watching your comfort TV show. There's self-care. So there are things that you consistently do that build your resilience. That could be like going to therapy, having a regular mindfulness practice, having a gratitude journal, these things that we hear about, budgeting so that you have economic safety. But like self-care practices are the things that you consistently do to build your resilience. They're not the things that you do to settle yourself. That's not to say that they're mutually exclusive, but I do like to say that it's good to recognize that like for something to be a self-care practice, it needs to be something you consistently do. So when there is a crisis, it's able to support you. And then community care is the thing I'd really love to see in our movement. And that's when we're doing these self-care practices with others and in community. And ideally, those are going to be ongoing, not just during a stressful event. And so that could be having a support group, having a regular hiking group, having like community meals, things that we do that bring us together to tend to ourselves. And when we talk about practices, and I'll send out more resources about practices because I'm always adding to this. So you can see I have a blank bullet because I'm always trying to think through this. But the thing that we don't want is for folks to dissociate. And so something that we integrate in a lot of the organizations that I consult with is, are we doing peer check-ins? There are a lot of great support groups, and I'll send that out in the resource guide. For some folks, that might look like working one-on-one with a climate-aware therapist. And then the other thing we always try to do is build self-compassion practices. And so a lot of times those are called metta or loving kindness meditations if you're looking for something just to like have a first glance at that. The other thing we know is that synchronized movement is something that our brain really loves, and is really good at tending to our nervous system when we're experiencing high levels of stress. And so easy ways to integrate that would be like switching to walking check-ins or meetings so that you're not like sitting in a chair, but you're moving together with someone who's checking in on you. Shaking So shaking is something we do in a lot of my coalition spaces. So if there's a tense moment or conflict, we'll pause and give people a shake break so they can just move their bodies and be able to move out some of that stress. And then towards collective care practices, like regularly integrating movement into the work that you're doing. So whether that's yoga, whether that's dance, hiking, skateboarding, whatever movement folks want to do or integrate in. But like synchronized movement is so good at settling the nervous system. The work that I do that I really love is grief work. And so that looks like we've been writing obituaries and eulogies for feelings of loss, holding memorial services and vigils so people can come together, and then creating remembrance art or markers. So like tombstones and stuff. Sounds bleaker than it is. And then balance. So something I do for a lot of environmental groups is like, what meetings can we cancel that don't add value? How do we take time to celebrate our wins, not just like in an email or an Instagram post, but like, can your movement come together and actually celebrate a win with music or dance or food, whatever feels good to your group? And then again, balancing your media. And Maggie's probably mad at me because I talked too long, but we'll open up to questions now. And all of this, you'll get the slides and a resource guide. Yay. Sorry, I was just so excited people wanted to talk about this. Okay. So could East Palestine, Ohio be considered a wealthy white community? So it definitely depends on your definitions of wealth. Though what we see is East Palestine typically falls below, at least 70% of households fall below the national poverty line. So that's why we don't typically consider a white wealthy neighborhood. But yeah, that's a great question. Definitions of wealth definitely vary by culture and by definition. So that's just by the US federal standard for poverty lines. And then the next question is, could you share a little bit about how BIPOC professionals, or excuse me, people of color professionals can protect themselves working in white environmental spaces? Practices to navigate ecological grief are appreciated, but when you're living in an affected community, it's difficult not to stay angry. So yes, this is huge. And this is a big reason I think we experience a lot of conflict in the environmental movement is because some folks are frontline communities or experiencing climate injustice every single day, and some folks are not, and they're still working in these spaces. And so something that we've been working on to tend to that is practices to be able to name when we see racism or implicit bias in our workspaces. And so I know diversity, equity, inclusion has been really under the scrutiny and under attack politically in the United States. But there's two things we look at organizationally is how do we make sure that we're able to call out, call in, hold people accountable. And the other thing that I've been noticing and really support different organizations with is how do we create and support more Black-led and people of color-led organizations. So here in Ohio, we have the Black Environmental Leaders Association, and that's something we notice a lot is making sure that folks have a community where they don't have to show up and explain climate injustice or what other systemic oppression they're navigating at the same time. But that's something we have been looking at is how do we make sure that frontline communities and those experiencing the most injustice in our community are front and center. And I know this isn't the answer that a lot of folks like to hear, but a lot of what I've seen work the best for my clients is moving to people of color-led organizations and volunteer groups so that they are in a supportive community. And then at the same time, looking at for our big greens and for our big environmental groups, how do we hold them accountable with being able to name when oppression shows up in their workplaces and giving people the accountability they deserve in the workplace. Any other questions about climate change and mental health? Okay, well, we have 3 minutes left. I'm sure Maggie has something to open or close this out with, but I'll just close this with a 1-minute grounding practice before we head out. And so my recommendation is that we shake it out. And so if you feel comfortable, you're welcome to participate as much or as little as you want. But I would come to the back of your chair. And then as you inhale, shaking the hands, lift them up. And then as you exhale, let it out. And we'll do that 2 more times together. Inhaling, arms come up. Exhale, they come down. And then one more time together. Inhale. And exhale. Okay, that was a lot. I'm super grateful for you. Maggie, I'll hand it back to you.
Awesome. Bailey, thank you so much for leading us through that. I've never done the shake it out on a Zoom call before, or like not in person with someone. And I really like that. So I wonder, we'll have to see if we can bring that into some of our Midwest BDC practices moving forward, because it does feel good to just get the energy out and get it flowing. All right. Well, I want to thank everyone who attended today, and I want to thank Bailey for presenting. I will be sending out a follow-up email with the resources that she mentioned, as well as the slides from today and the recording. So keep an eye out for that in your inbox. And I just want to, again, thank everyone else for joining us this afternoon, and have a great Thursday. Hope everyone has a good weekend, and we'll see you soon in another training, hopefully. All right. Bye, everybody.